Around the turn of the 20th century, a small group of Sicilian immigrants stepped off the boat in New York Harbor, carrying nothing but suitcases and ambitions. What they built would be known, decades later, as one of New York's most powerful crime families. But here's what most people don't know. The Gambino family didn't start with Carlo Gambino. It began with men like Salvatore D'Aquila and the earlier Lupo and Morello networks, who laid the groundwork in the crowded tenements of Brooklyn for an empire that would control entire industries. Tonight, we're going back to the very beginning, to understand how a handful of immigrants created a dynasty that lasted over a century. But to understand their success in America, we must first understand what they brought with them from the old country. Sicily in the 1800s was a place where many of the social systems that governed daily life were informal and localized. The island had been shaped by centuries of feudal traditions, creating communities where family loyalty and personal codes of honor carried more weight than distant government authority. Between the wealthy landowners and the peasants stood men who enforced order through their own methods, calling themselves men of honor and operating by codes that valued loyalty above life and silence above truth. The economic collapse of the 1890s shattered what stability Sicily had known. Crop failures destroyed the agricultural economy that employed most of the population. Political upheaval followed as the new Italian government tried to impose central control over an island that had governed itself through local networks for generations. For thousands of Sicilian families, survival meant leaving everything behind and crossing the Atlantic to America. But they carried with them the organizational structures, codes of conduct, and methods of control that had kept their communities together in Sicily. The journey to New York was brutal. Families crowded into the lowest decks of ships, sharing space with hundreds of other desperate immigrants. When they arrived at Ellis Island, the shock was overwhelming. New York in the 1890s was already the largest city in America, with more people packed into Manhattan than lived in all of Sicily. Most Sicilian immigrants settled in the same neighborhoods, recreating the village structures they had known back home. Little Italy in Manhattan and the Italian sections of Brooklyn became extensions of Sicily, complete with the same family networks and territorial divisions. The language barriers and cultural isolation kept these communities separate from mainstream American society and invisible to law enforcement. Police officers couldn't speak Italian, didn't understand the cultural dynamics, and had no idea how to navigate the complex web of relationships that governed daily life in these neighborhoods. Within these isolated communities, the old traditions took root and grew stronger. Men who had been minor players in Sicilian villages suddenly found opportunities to build real power in America. Among the early arrivals were figures like Ignazio Lupo and Giuseppe Morello, who brought Sicilian methods of organization to New York's immigrant neighborhoods. Lupo, known as Lupo the Wolf, established himself in East Harlem, while Morello built influence in Little Italy. Both men understood how to use the codes of loyalty and secrecy that had governed life in Palermo to create criminal enterprises in America. They maintained discipline through the same methods of honor and intimidation that had worked in Sicily. But now those methods could generate serious money through gambling, extortion, and protection rackets. The territorial control that had been limited to a few square miles in Sicily could now extend across entire city blocks or even multiple neighborhoods. Honor and loyalty remained the foundation of all relationships. But now those relationships served criminal enterprises that stayed invisible to outside authorities. The feuds and alliances that had shaped Sicilian village life crossed the ocean intact, but found new expressions in American cities. Old enemies who had fought over territory in Sicily now battled for control of gambling operations and dock territories. What made these transplanted traditions so powerful was their flexibility. The codes of honor and loyalty provided structure and discipline, but they could adapt to American conditions and American opportunities. The territorial divisions that had been based on geography in Sicily became based on business interests in America. The family structures that had been built around blood relationships in the old country expanded to include business partnerships and criminal alliances in the New World. By the early 1900s, these organizational structures had created something entirely new: American crime families that combined Sicilian traditions with American ambitions. They maintained the discipline and loyalty of the old secret societies while pursuing the wealth and power that America offered to those willing to take it by force. The codes of conduct that had governed life in Palermo now governed criminal territories in New York, creating a system that could grow, adapt, and survive in ways that purely American criminal gangs could never match. But this early success would face a major disruption. In 1910, both Lupo and Morello were arrested and imprisoned on counterfeiting charges, creating a power vacuum in New York's Italian underworld. The established order that these men had built suddenly needed new leadership. Into this void stepped a man who had been quietly building his own network in Brooklyn, someone who understood both the old Sicilian ways and the new American opportunities. Salvatore D'Aquila was that man. Around 1903, he established himself in Brooklyn using the same methods that successful Sicilian leaders had always employed: legitimate business fronts that provided perfect cover for criminal meetings and planning. Like many early crime leaders, D'Aquila operated from everyday businesses, where customers came for normal services while the real negotiations happened behind closed doors. These ordinary storefronts served as intelligence headquarters, where he could learn everything happening in the Italian community while maintaining complete invisibility to law enforcement. D'Aquila represents the forgotten founding father of what would become the Gambino Empire, a man whose name disappeared from history while his organizational blueprint survived for over a century. Born in the Sicilian province of Palermo around 1873, he arrived in New York with the wave of immigrants in the 1890s and immediately recognized that the chaotic immigrant neighborhoods offered opportunities that didn't exist back home. Unlike the flashier criminals who attracted attention to violence and intimidation, D'Aquila built power through patience and strategic thinking. He watched how the neighborhood worked, identified who controlled what, and slowly positioned himself as the man who could solve problems that the police couldn't or wouldn't handle. His legitimate business connections gave D'Aquila crucial advantages over purely violent criminals. Customers shared information about business disputes, family feuds, and financial troubles during routine transactions. D'Aquila listened carefully and filed away details about which merchants were struggling with protection money, which dock workers were skimming cargo, and which families were feuding over old grievances from Sicily. This constant flow of community intelligence allowed him to identify opportunities and threats before his competitors even knew they existed. When Morello and Lupo were imprisoned in 1910 on counterfeiting charges, D'Aquila seized the moment to establish his Palermitani family's dominance in East Harlem. The power vacuum left by their arrests created exactly the opening that D'Aquila had been preparing for during his years of careful organization. He moved quickly to absorb their territories and recruit their former associates, understanding that hesitation would allow rival leaders to claim the same prizes. Later, he would absorb Minio's gang through similar strategic timing, always expanding when his enemies were weakest rather than engaging in costly direct confrontations. D'Aquila used this intelligence to build the first truly organized Italian crime network in New York. He recruited fellow Sicilians who understood the old codes of honor and loyalty but were hungry for American opportunities. His early associates included men who worked legitimate jobs during the day but were willing to handle D'Aquila's business at night. Dock workers could provide information about valuable cargo shipments. Restaurant owners could serve as meeting places and message centers. Barbers in other neighborhoods could extend his intelligence network across Brooklyn and into Manhattan. Each recruit brought skills, connections, and territorial knowledge that strengthened the growing organization. The territorial boundaries that D'Aquila established became the template for organized crime in New York. He divided Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan into zones of influence based on Italian immigrant populations and economic opportunities. The Navy Yard area became his primary territory because of the dock workers and maritime trade. The Fulton Fish Market provided opportunities for extortion and labor control. Little Italy in Manhattan offered gambling and loan sharking possibilities. Among the crowded tenement populations, D'Aquila understood that territory meant nothing without the ability to defend it. So he recruited men who could enforce boundaries through intimidation and violence when necessary. His early partnerships with other immigrant crime leaders required delicate balance between cooperation and competition. D'Aquila formed alliances with Irish gangs who controlled different neighborhoods and had connections to Tammany Hall politics. He worked with Jewish criminals who ran gambling operations and had access to legitimate business financing. These partnerships allowed him to expand beyond the Italian community while maintaining control over his core territory. The agreements were fragile and required constant negotiation, but they prevented the destructive wars that could attract police attention and destroy everyone's business. D'Aquila's network controlled gambling, extortion, and protection rackets throughout the Italian neighborhoods with a sophistication that separated it from simple street gangs. His gambling operations included numbers running, dice games, and card rooms that provided steady income while serving community needs. The protection rackets targeted businesses that genuinely needed security in neighborhoods where police presence was minimal and unreliable. His loan sharking operation provided capital to immigrant entrepreneurs who couldn't get legitimate bank loans. Each activity generated revenue while filling real gaps in services that the legal economy couldn't or wouldn't provide. D'Aquila shaped the entire future of New York's underworld through early leadership decisions that established organizational principles still used decades later. He proved that criminal enterprises could succeed through intelligence and strategic planning rather than random violence and intimidation. His territorial system created sustainable income streams that could support large organizations over long periods. The recruitment methods he developed ensured loyalty while maintaining operational security. D'Aquila's network later passed through Mineo, then Mangano, the lineage that evolved into the Mangano-Gambino family. But D'Aquila's carefully built structure would soon face its greatest test. By the late 1920s, the success of his organizational model had inspired imitators and competitors throughout New York. Old Sicilian feuds that had been dormant for decades began to resurface as different crime leaders competed for the same territories and opportunities. The delicate balance of cooperation and competition that had kept the peace was starting to break down, and the stage was being set for a conflict that would determine the future of organized crime in America. The Castellammarese War erupted across 1930 and 1931, a secret conflict that would reshape organized crime forever. Bodies appeared in vacant lots and floating in the East River with increasing frequency. Newspapers reported the deaths as isolated gang violence, but insiders knew these murders were connected by invisible threads that stretched back to feuds that began decades earlier in Sicilian villages. The war had no official name and no declared battlefields, but it would create the modern American Mafia structure. The war's name came from Castellammarese del Golfo, a small fishing town in Sicily where many of the combatants had been born. What started as personal disputes between men who had known each other since childhood escalated into a battle for control of organized crime throughout New York City. The conflict would determine whether the old Sicilian ways of settling disputes through violence and vendetta would continue in America, or whether something new and more sophisticated would emerge. Giuseppe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano emerged as the primary combatants, each representing different approaches to organized crime in America. Masseria controlled extensive territories in Manhattan and had built his power through traditional methods of intimidation and violence. He demanded tribute from smaller operators and settled disputes through force rather than negotiation. His organization operated like a Sicilian village, with personal loyalty and family connections determining rank and responsibility. Maranzano represented a newer approach that emphasized military-style organization and strategic planning. He believed that American conditions required more sophisticated methods than the old Sicilian ways could provide. Smaller leaders faced impossible choices as they were forced to choose sides in a conflict that could destroy their own operations regardless of the outcome. Vincent Mangano, who had inherited D'Aquila's Brooklyn territories after his assassination in 1928, found himself caught between the two major factions. His waterfront operations were too valuable for either side to ignore, but supporting the wrong faction could mean death for him and destruction for his organization. Similar calculations played out in families throughout New York as leaders weighed personal relationships against strategic advantages and survival instincts. The strategic alliances and betrayals that marked this period revealed how fragile the bonds were that held organized crime together. Men who had been partners for decades suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of a conflict that demanded absolute loyalty. Business relationships that had generated profits for years crumbled. As territorial disputes escalated into personal vendettas, the old codes of honor that had provided stability became sources of additional conflict, as different interpretations of loyalty and respect created new reasons for violence. Young leaders like Lucky Luciano saw opportunity in the destruction of the old guard and began planning for a future that would eliminate the causes of such destructive wars. Luciano understood that the traditional Sicilian methods of leadership were creating more problems than they solved in America. The constant feuding and territorial disputes attracted law enforcement attention and disrupted business operations that could generate steady income for everyone involved. He began building alliances with younger leaders from different families who shared his vision of organized crime as a business rather than a collection of personal vendettas. The war's intensity peaked during the summer of 1931 as the body count rose and law enforcement pressure increased. Maseria's forces controlled more territory, but Maranzano's organization proved more disciplined and strategic in their operations. The violence began affecting legitimate businesses and drawing newspaper attention that threatened everyone's operations. Police raids increased as authorities tried to understand what was happening in the Italian neighborhoods. The surviving leaders realized that continued warfare would destroy everything they had built over the previous 3 decades. The dramatic resolution came through a series of coordinated assassinations that eliminated the old guard leadership and created space for new organizational structures. On April 15, 1931, Giuseppe Masseria was shot to death in a Coney Island restaurant while eating lunch with Lucky Luciano. 5 months later, in September 1931, Salvatore Maranzano was killed in his Manhattan office by gunmen posing as federal agents. These deaths weren't random acts of violence, but calculated moves designed to eliminate the leaders who represented the old ways and clear the path for something entirely different. The Castellammarese War's resolution allowed Lucky Luciano to reorganize the underworld into the 5-family structure that would dominate organized crime for decades. This new structure divided New York into 5 distinct territories, each controlled by a family with clearly defined boundaries and leadership hierarchies. The system prevented the kind of territorial disputes that had triggered the war, while providing mechanisms for resolving conflicts through negotiation rather than violence. The commission was established to oversee relationships between families and maintain the peace that business operations required. This governing body could settle disputes between families, authorize major operations, and ensure that no single leader could accumulate enough power to threaten the entire structure. The new organization eliminated the chaotic leadership methods that had caused the conflict in the first place. This institutional change created the framework that would allow one family in particular to build unprecedented power. With the old feuds settled and clear territorial boundaries established, ambitious leaders could focus on building criminal enterprises rather than fighting endless wars. The stage was now set for strategic expansion. Vincent Mangano seized this opportunity when he took control of the family in 1931. After 1931, Vincent Mangano led the family into union racketeering and waterfront control, building influence on the Manhattan and Brooklyn piers, while other Crime bosses fought over gambling territories and protection rackets in crowded neighborhoods. Mangano looked toward the Hudson River and East River piers that handled millions of tons of cargo every year. He understood that controlling the waterfront gave the family leverage over hiring, shipments, and delays that could affect construction and commerce, and that steady leverage was more valuable than quick, visible rackets. Vincent Mangano emerged as the strategic builder who laid the foundation for Gambino power through patience and long-term thinking rather than flashy displays of violence. Born in Palermo in 1888, he had witnessed the chaos of the Castellammarese War and learned valuable lessons about the dangers of attracting too much attention. Unlike leaders who built reputations through intimidation and public displays of power, Mangano preferred to work behind the scenes, building relationships and establishing control through methods that kept him invisible to law enforcement. His approach required years of careful planning, but it created something far more valuable than the quick profits that came from robbery and extortion. Mangano faced the enormous challenge of competing with more established families while building something that could last for generations. The Lucchese family controlled construction and labor unions throughout Manhattan. The Genovese family dominated gambling operations in Greenwich Village and the Lower East Side. The Bonanno and Colombo families had established territories in Brooklyn that generated steady income from neighborhood businesses. Mangano's family inherited some operations from the D'Aquila era, but these were small-scale activities that couldn't compete with the major revenue streams controlled by rival organizations. He identified the New York waterfront as the key to unlimited power and wealth because dock control offered something unique: the ability to influence every piece of commerce that flowed through America's largest port. The piers stretched for miles along Manhattan's West Side and Brooklyn's waterfront, handling cargo from ships that arrived daily from Europe, South America, and ports throughout the United States. Every container that moved from ship to truck required dock workers who could be controlled. Every cargo manifest could be altered to hide stolen merchandise. Every shipping schedule could be manipulated to benefit family operations. The waterfront represented a business opportunity that could generate income for decades without depending on the volatile neighborhood territories that other families fought over constantly. Mangano's patient approach to infiltrating and controlling the International Longshoremen's Association required years of careful relationship building and strategic positioning of family members in key union positions. He started by placing trusted associates in low-level union jobs where they could observe operations and identify opportunities for influence. These men learned which union officials could be corrupted, which shipping companies were willing to pay for labor peace, and which dock areas generated the most valuable cargo. Anthony Tough Tony Anastasio became president of ILA Local 1814 and helped steer payoffs through the Brooklyn waterfront unions, creating a direct pipeline between legitimate labor operations and family rackets. Mangano avoided the dramatic confrontations that might attract newspaper attention, instead building power through a series of small victories that gradually gave him influence over hiring, work assignments, and union contracts. He provided real benefits to dock workers who supported family operations, including better work assignments, protection from abusive supervisors, and access to stolen merchandise that could be sold for extra income. Workers who opposed family influence faced job losses, workplace accidents, and exclusion from the most profitable assignments. Union officials who cooperated received cash payments and business opportunities, while those who resisted found their authority undermined and their positions threatened. The shipping companies themselves became willing participants in family operations because Mangano offered them something valuable: labor, peace, and protection from the strikes and work slowdowns that plagued other ports. Companies that paid family tribute enjoyed smooth operations, reliable work schedules, and protection from the jurisdictional disputes between different unions that could shut down operations for weeks. The extra costs were simply passed on to customers as part of doing business in New York. This arrangement generated enormous profits while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business operations that law enforcement couldn't easily investigate or prosecute. Mangano's waterfront empire became the family's greatest asset by creating multiple income streams that supported all their other operations. The direct profits from dock control included tribute payments from shipping companies, kickbacks from union contracts, and proceeds from stolen cargo operations. These activities generated enough income to fund expansion into other areas, including construction, trucking, and waste management. The waterfront connections provided intelligence about valuable cargo shipments that could be hijacked. The union relationships created opportunities to place family members in legitimate jobs that served as covers for criminal activities. This waterfront foundation proved so valuable that it sustained the family through decades of leadership changes, federal investigations, and competition from rival organizations. The income streams were diversified enough that losing any single operation wouldn't threaten the family's survival. The legitimate business connections provided protection from law enforcement that pure criminal enterprises couldn't maintain. The union relationships created a base of community support that made family operations appear to serve working-class interests rather than exploit them. But Mangano's careful strategy would face an unexpected challenge from within his own organization. His choice of underboss would bring exactly the kind of attention that his patient approach had been designed to avoid. Albert Anastasia served as Vincent Mangano's underboss, but his reputation for violence made even hardened criminals nervous. Born Umberto Anastasio in Calabria, Italy, in 1902, he arrived in New York as a teenager and quickly established himself as someone who solved problems through methods that other men couldn't stomach. Anastasia, leader of Murder Inc., served as underboss and later took control in 1951, influence through fear and brutal efficiency. His reputation for violence set him apart even in a world where intimidation was a standard business tool. Men who had survived decades in organized crime would change the subject, preferred subtle influence and long-term planning that kept the family invisible to law enforcement and the general public. He built relationships slowly and maintained them through mutual benefit rather than intimidation. Anastasia operated like a weapon that could be pointed at problems and expected to eliminate them completely. His approach generated immediate results and sent clear messages to anyone who might challenge family authority. Approach and Anastasia's brutal methods created an internal power struggle that threatened to tear the family apart from within. Mangano valued the waterfront empire he had built through decades of patient work and understood that maintaining it required political connections, and Anastasia saw these concerns as weakness and believed that respect came only through fear. Their disagreements played out in family meetings where Mangano would advocate for subtle solutions while Anastasia pushed for direct action that would settle disputes permanently. These philosophical differences reflected deeper conflicts about the future direction of organized crime in America. Anastasia's control of Murder, Incorporated made him both valuable and terrifying to the family, because he commanded an organization that could eliminate problems across the entire country. Murder, Inc. operated as a professional killing service that handled contracts for crime families throughout New York and beyond. The organization employed specialists who could make deaths appear accidental, create alibis that would satisfy police investigations, and eliminate witnesses who might threaten ongoing criminal operations. Anastasia's position as the head of this national murder network gave him influence that extended far beyond the who needed serious problems solved permanently. His notorious reputation for violence became legendary throughout New York's underworld and established him as someone who never hesitated when business required extreme measures. In 1939, Anastasia ordered the murder of Maurice Diamond. Diamond was found shot to death in his car outside his Brooklyn home, sending a clear message to other Union officials about the consequences of resistance. When dock worker Peter Panto began organizing legitimate protests against corrupt Union leadership in 1939, Anastasia had him kidnapped and murdered, with the body buried in a New Jersey lime pit where it wouldn't be discovered for years. His methods spread fear throughout New York's underworld, while bringing unwanted attention from law enforcement agencies that had previously ignored family operations. Newspaper stories about mysterious disappearances and brutal murders. The FBI started paying closer attention to Italian neighborhoods and building files on suspected crime family members. This increased scrutiny threatened the low-profile approach that had allowed the family to build power without interference from law enforcement. The incompatible leadership styles created a growing power struggle that affected every aspect of family operations and divided members between those who supported younger members who wanted quick advancement, often gravitated toward Mangano's careful methods that had provided stability and steady profits without the constant threat of violent retaliation. This division weakened the family's unity and created factions that pursued different would later contribute to his own downfall when his ordering of the murder of Arnold Schuster in 1952 angered other crime families. Was killed on Anastasia's orders simply because he had cooperated with police. This high-profile killing violated the unwritten rules about targeting civilians and created an unstable situation that increased law enforcement scrutiny and internal family tensions. Direction. The brewing conflict would soon reach a breaking point that would change everything. Vincent Mangano disappeared in April 1951, and his body was never found. Philip Mangano's body was discovered days later. Vincent had left his home for what appeared to be a routine meeting, telling his wife he had received a phone call from someone asking him to meet at a location in Brooklyn. He dressed in his usual careful manner, straightened his tie, and kissed her goodbye before walking out the front door. He carried no weapon and brought no bodyguards, suggesting he believed the meeting involved trusted associates rather than potential enemies. The disappearance of the Mangano brothers created a family crisis that threatened to destroy everything Vincent had built over 2 decades of careful leadership. Philip Mangano, Vincent's younger brother and trusted advisor, unanswered and their usual meeting places abandoned. The waterfront operations that depended on daily supervision began showing signs of confusion as dock workers and unions officials waited for instructions that never came. Business partners who expected routine meetings found themselves dealing with lower-level family members who lacked authority to make important decisions. Philip's body was discovered 3 days later in a marsh near Sheepshead Bay, shot multiple times in what appeared to be an execution. The condition of the body indicated that Philip had been killed shortly after his disappearance, but the location where he was found provided no clues about where the murder had actually taken place. Vincent's complete disappearance created far more dangerous uncertainty and was widely believed to be behind the brothers' deaths. But his position as underboss and his reputation for violence made direct challenges extremely risky. Within hours of the brothers' disappearance becoming known, Anastasia called a meeting of senior family members and announced that he was assuming control of all operations. He claimed that Vincent had given him specific instructions to take charge if anything happened to both brothers, though no one could verify these alleged instructions. Family members who might have questioned his authority understood that, with other crime family leaders who had their own interests in the outcome of this succession crisis, the Commission had established protocols for handling leadership transitions. Wouldn't disrupt the territorial agreements and business relationships that had maintained peace since the Castellammarese War. They also needed to evaluate whether Anastasia could control his violent tendencies enough to maintain the low profile that all families required to avoid law enforcement attention. Other family leaders and the ECOM mission handled this unprecedented situation by accepting Anastasia's leadership while maintaining careful surveillance of his activities and decision-making processes. The Lucchese family, which had close business relationships with Mangano operations, insisted on maintaining their existing agreements regardless of the leadership change. The Genovese family demanded assurances that Anastasia wouldn't use his new position to expand into their territories or interfere with their operations. Crisis created an opening for a quiet, strategic mind to observe the power dynamics and position himself for future opportunities. Carlo Gambino had served as a loyal soldier under Vincent to generate profits without attracting unwanted attention, while other family members focused on the immediate crisis of leadership transition. Gambino studied the situation and began building relationships that could serve him if Anastasia's volatile leadership style created future problems. Historians see this as an early sign of his political skill and understanding that Anastasia's reputation for violence made him powerful in the short term, but vulnerable to the kind of law enforcement pressure that could destroy the family's long-term interests. Carlo Gambino positioned himself during this chaos by maintaining loyalty to Anastasia, while quietly building support among family members who preferred the strategic approach that Vincent Mangano had represented. He continued managing his assigned territories with the same efficiency that had earned Vincent's trust, proving that family operations could continue functioning smoothly despite the leadership crisis. Gambino cultivated relationships with union officials, business partners, and political contacts who had worked with the family under Vincent's leadership. These connections appreciated his stability and reliability compared to the unsuccessful or attracted too much law enforcement attention. Gambino demonstrated that he understood both the violent realities of organized crime and the subtle political skills necessary to maintain power over long periods. He showed respect for family traditions while adapting to changing circumstances that required new approaches to old problems. The family's survival would depend on maintaining the legitimate business connections that Vincent Mangano had spent decades building, relationships that required a very different kind of leadership than Anastasia's dramatic methods could provide. Under Albert Anastasia's leadership, the family expanded their focus beyond the waterfront into the industries that built and maintained New York City, the concrete that formed Manhattan's skyscrapers, the trucks that delivered goods to every neighborhood, and the garbage that disappeared from every street corner, all moved through systems that the family had spent decades infiltrating. This wasn't the flashy criminal activity that made newspaper headlines or attracted federal attention. It was patient, methodical work that required understanding how legitimate businesses actually operated and finding ways to make those businesses dependent on family cooperation. The family's strategic focus on labor unions represented their path to lasting power because unions controlled access to the skilled workers who kept New York's economy functioning. Every construction project needed electricians, plumbers, and heavy equipment operators who belonged to specific unions. Every trucking company required drivers who held union cards and followed union rules about routes, schedules, and cargo handling. Every major business generated waste that had to be collected and disposed of by companies that employed union workers. By placing trusted people in unions and companies, the family could steer hires, delay or accelerate projects, and extract steady kickbacks from businesses that needed labor peace to operate profitably. This approach required patience and subtlety that other families couldn't match because it meant building relationships over years rather than generating immediate profits through robbery or extortion. Family members had to learn the complex rules and regulations that governed union operations, construction contracts, and municipal services. They needed to understand how legitimate business leaders made decisions, what motivated union officials, and how political connections influenced government contracts. This knowledge took time to acquire and required family members who could operate successfully in both the criminal underworld and the legitimate business community. Under later Gambino leadership, the family acquired behind-the-scenes influence over Teamsters Local 282 and used that to affect access to building materials and construction jobs. This union represented the truck drivers who transported materials to every job site in New York. Concrete couldn't reach construction sites without trucks. Steel beams couldn't be delivered without drivers who understood how to navigate city streets with oversized loads. Sand, gravel, and other building materials moved from suppliers to contractors only through trucking companies that employed Local 282 members. A work slowdown or strike by Local 282 could shut down dozens of construction sites simultaneously. giving the family substantial influence over key locals, crews, and hiring decisions. The complex relationships between legitimate union leaders, corrupt officials, and crime family representatives required careful management to maintain the appearance of normal union operations while serving family interests. Legitimate union leaders often cooperated with family influence because they received benefits, including higher wages for their members, better working conditions, and protection from employers who might otherwise ignore union contracts. Corrupt officials received direct payments for their cooperation, but also gained access to lucrative business opportunities and political connections that enhanced their personal wealth and influence. Crime family representatives maintained these relationships through a combination of financial incentives, business partnerships, and implicit threats that ensured continued cooperation. Construction projects, trucking routes, and waste management operations became areas of family influence through systematic infiltration of the companies and unions that controlled these industries. Major construction projects required multiple subcontractors who needed family approval to avoid labor problems, delivery delays, and regulatory complications. Trucking companies discovered that routes through certain neighborhoods required family permission to avoid hijackings, union disputes, and mysterious mechanical problems that could destroy their schedules and reputations. Waste management companies found that family connections were essential for obtaining the permits, routes, and disposal sites necessary to operate profitably in New York's competitive market. This systematic influence created sustainable, long-term income streams that supported all other family operations while providing legitimate covers for criminal activities. Construction companies paid regular tribute to ensure labor, peace, and timely completion of projects. Trucking companies contributed to family income through payments that guaranteed safe passage and preferential treatment from union officials. Waste management operations generated profits through inflated contracts and disposal arrangements that other companies couldn't access. These income streams were diversified enough that problems in any single industry wouldn't threaten the family's overall financial stability. The revenue from legitimate business operations also funded expansion into other criminal activities, including loan sharking, gambling, and eventually drug trafficking. Family members could use their positions in construction and trucking to identify opportunities for hijacking valuable cargo shipments. Union connections provided intelligence about businesses that were struggling financially and might need high-interest loans to survive. The political relationships necessary to maintain influence in legitimate industries opened doors to government contracts and zoning decisions that benefited family business interests. The Gambinos focused on labor unions and dock control instead of the flashier rackets other families pursued because they understood that sustainable criminal enterprises required diversified income sources that couldn't be easily disrupted by law enforcement. Gambling operations could be shut down by police raids. Protection rackets generated resentment and attracted federal attention. Union influence, construction control, and waste management operations were integrated into the legitimate economy in ways that made them nearly impossible to eliminate without destroying essential city services. These legitimate connections would enable unprecedented expansion by providing the financial resources, political influence, and business expertise necessary to build a criminal empire that could operate on a national scale. But managing this complex web of relationships required a different kind of leader than Albert Anastasia, someone who understood that true power came from being indispensable rather than feared. Carlo Gambino represented that different kind of leader. He never raised his voice, rarely used violence personally, and most New Yorkers had never heard his name, which was exactly how he planned it. While Albert Anastasia built his reputation through brutal displays of power that made headlines and attracted federal attention, Gambino operated like a shadow, moving through the background of family operations. He attended meetings without speaking unless asked direct questions. He handled his assigned territories with quiet efficiency that generated steady profits without creating problems for family leadership. His approach to organized crime resembled that of a careful businessman who understood that the most successful operations were those that nobody noticed or discussed. Carlo Gambino's methodical approach to accumulating power within the family structure began with his understanding that influence came through making himself indispensable rather than intimidating. Born in Palermo, Sicily, in 1902, he arrived in New York as a young man with relatives who were already established in the criminal underworld. Unlike other ambitious family members who sought rapid advancement through displays of toughness or loyalty to powerful sponsors, Gambino focused on learning every aspect of family operations and making himself useful to multiple levels of leadership. He studied how money flowed through different activities, how territorial agreements were maintained, and how relationships with other families and legitimate businesses actually functioned in practice. His low-profile effectiveness became clear early in his career. Carlo Gambino served only 22 months in prison in 1937 for tax evasion, after which he continued to rise through the ranks. This brief sentence demonstrated his ability to handle legal problems without compromising family operations or revealing information that could damage other members. While other criminals accumulated lengthy prison records that made them liabilities to their organizations, Gambino's clean record and careful methods allowed him to maintain his position and continue building influence within the family structure. He maneuvered through the dangerous politics of succession, while Anastasia grew increasingly unstable by maintaining careful neutrality that allowed him to work with any potential leader while avoiding commitment to any specific faction. During the tense period following Vincent Mangano's disappearance, Gambino continued managing his waterfront responsibilities with the same reliability he had shown under the previous leadership. He avoided the internal debates about family direction that divided other members into competing camps. When Anastasia made controversial decisions that generated criticism from senior family members, Gambino implemented orders without complaint while quietly maintaining relationships with those who disagreed with the new direction. His marriage connections and Sicilian networks provided crucial support and intelligence that enhanced his value to family operations, while giving him access to information that other members couldn't obtain. Gambino had married into the Castellano family, which had its own extensive connections to Sicilian immigrants and business opportunities throughout Brooklyn. These relationships provided him with intelligence about legitimate business operations, political developments, and law enforcement activities that affected family interests. His wife's relatives included men who worked in construction, trucking, and dock operations where family members needed reliable information about contracts, schedules, and potential problems that could disrupt operations. The patient cultivation of relationships with other family leaders and commission members required years of careful attention to the protocols and personal preferences that governed interactions between different criminal organizations. Gambino understood that lasting influence required respect from leaders outside his own family who could provide support during internal disputes or succession crises. He cultivated relationships with the Lucchese family through their shared interests in construction and labor union activities. His connections with the Genovese family developed through careful attention to territorial boundaries and business agreements that prevented conflicts. These relationships were built through small favors, reliable information sharing, and consistent respect for the agreements that maintained peace between families. His understanding that lasting power came from being indispensable rather than feared shaped every aspect of his approach to family politics and business operations. Gambino recognized that leaders who ruled through intimidation created resentment and opposition that eventually led to their downfall. Vincent Mangano had maintained power for 2 decades through strategic thinking and careful relationship management. Albert Anastasia controlled the family through violence and the threat of violence. But this approach generated enemies and attracted law enforcement attention that threatened everyone's operations. Gambino studied both examples and concluded that sustainable leadership required combining Mangano's strategic approach with enough toughness to maintain respect in a violent world. The moment when his careful preparation would pay off dramatically was approaching as Anastasia's leadership style created increasing problems for family operations and relationships with other criminal organizations. Federal investigations into organized crime were intensifying throughout the 1950s, making Anastasia's high-profile approach more dangerous for everyone involved in family activities. His violent reputation and connection to Murder Incorporated attracted attention from prosecutors who were building cases against organized crime leaders. Other commission members began expressing concerns about whether Anastasia's methods were putting all New York families at risk of increased law enforcement pressure. Carlo Gambino quietly positioned himself as the logical successor by demonstrating that he could provide the steady leadership and strategic thinking that the family needed to survive in a changing environment. He rose from soldier to consigliere, then to underboss, building support at each level through competence rather than intimidation. When Anastasia was assassinated in 1957, Gambino's careful positioning allowed him to assume leadership with minimal internal opposition. His transition to boss represented a return to the strategic approach that had built family power under Vincent Mangano, but with the added benefit of decades spent studying what worked and what didn't in organized crime leadership. His success would depend not just on internal family management, but on the complex web of relationships he had built with leaders and organizations far beyond his own territory. These partnerships opened doors to revenue streams and opportunities that no single family could access independently. While other crime families built power through intimidation and territorial conquest, the Gambinos understood that lasting influence came through strategic alliances that multiplied their capabilities without multiplying their enemies. These relationships weren't casual friendships or temporary convenience arrangements. They represented carefully negotiated business partnerships that required constant attention and diplomatic skill to maintain over decades of changing circumstances and competing interests. The strategic alliances that amplified Gambino power beyond their own operations began with the recognition that no single family could control every profitable opportunity in New York's complex criminal landscape. The city was simply too large, with too many different ethnic communities and business districts for any one organization to dominate completely. Smart leaders understood that cooperation with other groups could provide access to opportunities that would otherwise require expensive and dangerous territorial wars to obtain. These partnerships allowed each group to focus on their areas of expertise while sharing information and resources that benefited everyone involved. Cooperation with rivals required delicate balance and constant negotiation because the same qualities that made potential partners valuable also made them dangerous. Other crime families had their own ambitions, territorial interests, and internal politics that could conflict with Gambino objectives at any moment. Business partnerships that generated profits one week could become sources of conflict the next if circumstances changed or misunderstandings developed. Maintaining these relationships required leaders who could distinguish between minor disagreements that could be resolved through negotiation and major conflicts that threatened fundamental interests worth fighting over. The partnership with Lansky opened doors to national gambling networks that transformed the Gambinos from a regional crime family into players on the national stage. Lansky's gambling operations in Cuba and the Bahamas provided the Gambinos access to high-stakes international gambling that generated far more income than neighborhood numbers running or small-scale card games. His expertise in moving money through legitimate financial institutions provided services that Italian crime families needed but couldn't develop independently. Lansky's political connections and business relationships provided protection and legitimacy that helped family operations avoid the law enforcement attention that destroyed less sophisticated criminal enterprises. This Jewish connection proved invaluable because Lansky's organization operated in business and social circles that remained closed to Italian crime families, regardless of their wealth or influence. Jewish criminals had established relationships with legitimate businessmen, politicians, and financial institutions that dated back decades and provided access to opportunities that violence and intimidation couldn't obtain. These relationships were based on shared cultural backgrounds, religious connections, and business partnerships that had developed over generations of cooperation in legitimate enterprises. The Gambinos recognized that forcing their way into these networks would create unnecessary enemies and attract unwanted attention, while partnership with Lansky provided natural access to resources they couldn't obtain independently. The relationship with the Lucchese family dominated construction, bidding, and labor contracts throughout New York through carefully coordinated activities that prevented destructive competition while maximizing profits for both organizations. The marriage alliance between the Gambino and Lucchese families, including Thomas Gambino's marriage to Lucchese's daughter, cemented these business relationships through family bonds that made cooperation more reliable and profitable. Rather than fighting over the same construction projects and union positions, the two families divided responsibilities based on their existing strengths and connections. The Gambinos focused on waterfront operations, trucking, and waste management, where their dock control provided natural advantages. The Luccheses concentrated on construction unions, concrete suppliers, and building contractors, where their established relationships gave them superior influence. Commission politics required careful management of competing interests and territorial disputes through formal and informal negotiations that maintained the peace necessary for profitable operations. The commission created a forum for negotiation among families, and Gambino used commission influence to become a leading figure among the five families. The commission included representatives from all five New York families, plus delegates from major crime families in other cities who had interests that could conflict with local operations. Managing these relationships required understanding the personal ambitions, business interests, and territorial concerns of leaders who controlled their own criminal enterprises and had their own reasons for cooperation or conflict with Gambino. Activities. The formal structure of the commission provided mechanisms for resolving disputes that might otherwise escalate into violent conflicts that damaged everyone's business interests. Regular meetings allowed family leaders to discuss territorial boundaries, business partnerships, and jurisdictional questions before they became sources of serious conflict. The commission could authorize cooperative ventures that required multiple families to contribute resources or expertise. When disputes did develop, the commission provided neutral arbitration that allowed all parties to accept resolutions without appearing weak or submitting to rivals. This system prevented the kind of destructive wars that had characterized earlier periods of organized crime history. These alliances gave the Gambinos access to national gambling networks and construction trade influence that multiplied their reach beyond Brooklyn, preventing destructive wars while enabling expansion through networks of cooperation that replaced the cycle of conflict and retaliation that had weakened all crime families during the Castellammarese War. Instead of fighting over limited territories and resources, the partnership system allowed each family to focus on their areas of strength while accessing opportunities controlled by allies. Information sharing prevented costly mistakes and provided intelligence about law enforcement activities that threatened everyone's operations. Coordinated activities could accomplish objectives that no single family could achieve independently, while distributing risks and costs among multiple organizations. The alliance network that Carlo Gambino had carefully constructed would soon face its greatest test as global events created opportunities that no one could have predicted or prepared for. World War II transformed the American economy overnight, creating massive demand for ships, weapons, and military supplies that required unprecedented coordination between government agencies and private contractors. New York's waterfront became the most critical shipping point in the country, as millions of tons of military equipment flowed through the docks toward European battlefields. Wartime increased the volume and importance of port activity, which in turn offered wider opportunities for families already established on the waterfront to expand their influence and revenue. The dramatically changed economic conditions created new opportunities. while reducing oversight in ways that transformed the entire landscape of organized crime in New York. The massive expansion of government contracts, defense production, and military shipping created opportunities for corruption that hadn't existed. During peacetime, rationing programs established by the Office of Price Administration created artificial scarcity that made certain goods extremely valuable on secondary markets. Labor shortages in essential industries gave workers and union officials increased leverage over employers who needed reliable production schedules to meet government contracts. Waterfront control became more valuable than ever because military shipping required reliable dock operations that could handle sensitive cargo without delays or security problems. The government needed smooth operations on docks where military supplies were being loaded onto ships bound for combat zones. The Gambinos' extensive infiltration of dock unions and shipping companies positioned them to provide the kind of reliability and security that military officials required. Family influence could prevent work slowdowns, ensure priority handling for military cargo, and maintain the operational security that wartime shipping demanded. The strategic partnerships that the family had built over decades proved essential for capitalizing on wartime opportunities because no single organization could handle the scale and complexity of the new business environment. Meyer Lansky's financial expertise became crucial for managing the increased cash flow from expanded operations. The Lucchese family's construction connections provided access to defense contracts that required coordination between multiple unions and contractors. These partnerships allowed the Gambinos to participate in opportunities that would have been impossible for any single family to handle independently. Defense contracts and construction projects provided new opportunities for influence over labor and materials that established the family as significant players in the wartime economy. The government awarded enormous contracts for building military facilities, manufacturing weapons, and providing services that supported the war effort. These contracts required construction workers, truck drivers, and other laborers who belonged to unions that the Gambinos influenced. Companies that wanted to complete government contracts on schedule discovered that family cooperation could prevent labor disputes and delivery delays that might result in contract cancellations and financial losses. Military construction projects throughout the New York area required coordination between multiple contractors, suppliers, and labor unions that created opportunities for the kind of systematic influence that the Gambinos had developed in civilian construction. Army bases, navy yards, and aircraft manufacturing facilities needed skilled workers who could complete projects on accelerated schedules. The family's influence over construction unions allowed them to ensure that these projects received priority access to experienced workers, while maintaining relationships with contractors who appreciated reliable labor cooperation. The expansion of legitimate business operations during wartime provided perfect covers for criminal activities while generating substantial income from legal sources that couldn't be easily investigated or prosecuted. Family members who held positions in shipping companies, construction firms, and trucking operations could conduct business that appeared completely legitimate while serving family interests. Government contracts provided steady income that supported family operations without depending entirely on traditional criminal activities like gambling and loan sharking. These legitimate income sources also provided tax documentation and business records that helped family members maintain respectable public profiles. Wartime economic conditions allowed the family to establish relationships with government officials and military contractors that would continue providing benefits long after the war ended. Military officers who worked with family-connected companies during the war maintained those business relationships when they returned to civilian life. Government officials who had cooperated with family operations during wartime emergencies continued those relationships when they moved to private sector positions. Defense contractors who had benefited from family labor cooperation remained willing to work with family-connected suppliers and subcontractors in peacetime construction projects. The dramatic expansion of family operations during World War II required new organizational structures and management methods that could handle increased complexity while maintaining the security and discipline that had protected the family for decades. The volume of business activity generated by wartime opportunities demanded more sophisticated record-keeping, communication systems, and coordination between different family operations. Carlo Gambino emerged as the family member most capable of managing this increased complexity through his careful attention to detail and his understanding of both legitimate business practices and criminal operational security. His role in managing wartime expansion demonstrated the leadership capabilities that would later make him indispensable to family operations and position him for advancement within the family hierarchy. Gambino showed that he could coordinate multiple activities simultaneously while maintaining the low profile that family security required. He developed relationships with legitimate business partners that generated income and provided protection from law enforcement scrutiny. His careful approach to expansion ensured that increased activity didn't create the kind of attention that could threaten existing operations or attract federal investigations. The war years proved that the organizational foundation built over decades could support massive expansion when opportunities arose. But they also revealed that managing increased complexity required leadership skills that went beyond traditional criminal methods. The family needed leaders who understood legitimate business operations, government contracting procedures, and the political relationships that influenced both military and civilian economic activities. The combination of criminal organizational skills and legitimate business expertise would become essential for success in the post-war economy by war's end. The Gambinos had transformed from a regional waterfront operation into an organization with national connections and the financial resources to compete with any crime family in America. The relationships, income streams, and organizational capabilities developed during the war years provided the foundation for unprecedented expansion that would reshape organized crime throughout the country. The strategic positioning was complete. By 1950, the pieces were in place: waterfront control, labor dominance, political connections, and strategic alliances. But one final move would make Carlo Gambino the most powerful crime boss in America. The foundation that had been built over 5 decades of patient work was unlike anything that existed in the criminal underworld, where other families had focused on quick profits from gambling and extortion. The Gambinos had created an integrated system that controlled essential services throughout New York City. Their influence extended into every major industry that kept the city functioning, from construction and trucking to waste management and food distribution. All the foundational elements, built over decades, were ready to support unprecedented expansion that would transform the family from a regional crime organization into a national criminal enterprise. The waterfront operations that Vincent Mangano had developed in the 1930s now provided substantial influence over sections of the Port of New York, generating millions of dollars in annual tribute from companies that needed reliable dock operations. The labor union infiltration that had begun with small construction locals now included influence over Teamsters locals, longshoremen's unions, and waste management workers who controlled essential city services. The political connections that had started with neighborhood ward bosses now extended to city council members, municipal contractors, and federal officials who made decisions affecting business operations throughout the metropolitan area. The family's careful preparation differentiated them from rivals who relied on violence and intimidation because they had built power through relationships and business partnerships rather than fear and territorial conquest. The Genovese family controlled significant gambling operations, but remained vulnerable to police raids and federal investigations that could eliminate their primary income sources overnight. The Lucchese family had established influence in construction, but lacked the diversified income streams that could sustain them through economic downturns or law enforcement crackdowns. The Bonanno and Colombo families maintained their traditional neighborhood territories, but hadn't developed the legitimate business connections that provided protection from prosecution and opportunities for expansion.